I didn't explode when it happened, didn't argue, didn't even flinch, because the real damage wasn't public, it was internal. The quiet understanding that the career I'd built, the identity I'd poured 12 years into, had already been taken from me long before I resigned, stripped away piece by piece while I smiled through meetings where my work wore someone else's name, until the day I watched Richard and Jonathan accept praise for a strategy that had cost me nights, relationships, and parts of myself I will never get back. And in that moment, I felt something collapse so cleanly it scared me. A numbness settling where ambition used to live, rage sinking inward instead of outward, becoming colder, heavier, more deliberate, because I finally saw the pattern clearly. This hadn't been neglect or chance, it was orchestration. And as I walked away without a word, I wasn't grieving the loss of a job anymore. I was burying the version of myself who believed survival required permission. And that was the moment I stopped trying to survive. I remember the room more clearly than I remember my own face that day. The glass walls, the muted hum of the projector, the way the city outside looked distant, unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. I was seated slightly off to the side, not by accident, watching Richard stand exactly where I had suggested weeks earlier, centered, confident, framed by slides I had designed at 2 a.m. Outwardly, I was calm, hands folded, neutral expression. Inside, something was cracking in slow motion. I watched the betrayal unfold from several angles at once. What I saw was applause, senior partners nodding, Jonathan Reeves smiling that thin, satisfied smile people wear when they're about to claim ownership. What I felt was disorientation, like I'd stepped into the wrong version of my own life. What I didn't say was my name, even as each bullet point echoed words I had rehearsed alone. What I pretended not to notice was the way Richard avoided eye contact with me, as if even accidental acknowledgement might fracture the illusion. The applause lasted longer than it should have. That detail still bothers me. It wasn't polite applause, it was earned applause, and that made it worse. Because the room wasn't stupid, they could feel the strength of the work. They just didn't care who had done it. And in that realization, something permanent was taken from me, the belief that excellence eventually protects you. I kept my posture steady. That was the performance. I nodded at the right moments. I even smiled once, a small one, when someone across the table glanced at me with what I thought was recognition. But it wasn't. It was relief. Relief that I wasn't making things uncomfortable, that I was staying in my place. The disturbing detail didn't surface until later. That night at home, scrolling through internal emails, I saw an early draft of the presentation forwarded to Jonathan weeks before, with my name removed from the document metadata. Not forgotten, removed. That was the moment the humiliation deepened into something colder. This hadn't been opportunism, it had been preparation. I slept badly after that, not because I was angry, but because I felt hollow. I went to work as usual, answered questions, finished tasks. The office saw the same Michael. What they didn't see was the fracture spreading quietly under the surface. I had lost more than recognition. I had lost trajectory. The future I thought I was moving toward, the role, the authority, the voice, had been quietly redirected to someone else, using my own work as the bridge. When I finally resigned, there was no confrontation because by then the collapse had already happened. Richard's smirk wasn't the insult people think it was confirmation. He believed the story was over, that I would disappear, that my silence meant defeat. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? I asked myself that question for weeks, and somewhere between that room and my final day, I realized something that changed everything. This wasn't a single theft. It was a system, a method. And systems can be studied. As I left Hawthorne & Co., I wasn't confused anymore. I was calm.
and for the first time I understood that what happened to me hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. Leaving Hawthorne and Co. didn't feel dramatic. It felt anticlimactic. No farewell emails, no goodbye drinks, just a quiet walkout with a cardboard box that held almost nothing of value, because the real assets had never been allowed to sit on my desk in the first place. For the first few weeks, I did nothing that looked like revenge. That was intentional. I watched instead. From the outside, they celebrated. LinkedIn posts appeared, Richard shared a polished update about team success and visionary leadership. Jonathan was quoted in an industry newsletter talking about the bright line strategy as if it had materialized, fully formed in his mind. I read every word without reacting. No comments, no corrections. Silence makes people careless. They relaxed quickly. That surprised me at first. I had expected some tension, some anxiety about what I might do next. Instead, they behaved like men who believed the risk had passed simply because the source of it had been removed. In meetings I no longer attended, they laughed. In emails I was still copied on by mistake, they spoke freely. They underestimated the value of observation. I stayed invisible on purpose. I didn't announce my next move. I didn't rush into a new role. I let the absence speak while I gathered information. It was during this phase that I noticed something important. The systems I had built weren't just complex, they were dependent. Not fragile, but specific. They worked because I understood the logic beneath them, not just the surface-level processes Richard liked to repeat in presentations. The small win came quietly. Brightline Capital reached out, not to Hawthorne, but to me. Not formally, just a question, a clarification request about a component of the strategy that suddenly wasn't producing the expected outcomes. I responded carefully. No accusations, no grand revelations. I answered exactly what they asked, nothing more, and suggested a minor adjustment that exposed a flaw in how Hawthorne was now managing the framework. Within 2 weeks, the ripple appeared. Hawthorne missed a minor internal benchmark, nothing public, nothing catastrophic, just enough to create discomfort, enough for Brightline to start asking sharper questions, enough for Richard to feel a pressure he couldn't quite explain. What they didn't know, and this was the weakness, was that their authority rested on a borrowed understanding. Richard could present, Jonathan could sell, but neither of them truly understood why the system worked, only that it had. They assumed it would continue to do so out of habit. I watched Richard's tone change in internal communications. Shorter sentences, more follow-ups, less confidence masked as enthusiasm. He started scheduling extra meetings, trying to regain control through visibility. That's what people do when they don't know where the problem is, but feel it growing closer. The mini-revenge wasn't about damage, it was about doubt, about making them question the stability they thought they owned. And it worked. I felt the satisfaction not as excitement, but as confirmation, calm, controlled, almost clinical. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always feel like anger. Sometimes it feels like alignment, like finally using the situation exactly as it is instead of how you wish it were. I remained silent publicly. I declined invitations to comment. I didn't correct misinformation. Letting people misunderstand your position is a powerful form of leverage. They filled the silence with their own assumptions, and those assumptions were wrong. There were moments I almost stopped. Late nights where I wondered if walking away entirely would be easier, if letting them fail on their own timeline would be enough. But then I remembered the removal of my name, the deliberate erasure, and I understood that this wasn't about punishment, it was about balance. The pressure continued to build, slowly, predictably. Brightline scheduled an unscheduled review. Jonathan requested additional reports. Richard started asking questions he should have been asking months earlier. Each step revealed how little foundation they actually had. I didn't rush the next move. Patience was part of the structure now. I knew where this was going, and more importantly, I knew where it wasn't. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic exposure, just a gradual narrowing of options until the truth had nowhere left to hide. They thought my silence meant the story had ended. I knew it had just started.
The first sign that fear had entered the room was how quickly they stopped celebrating. The tone shifted before the numbers did. Emails became cautious. Meetings multiplied without producing clarity. What had begun as a quiet discomfort after the Bright Line review started to ripple outward, touching departments that had never interacted with my work directly but depended on its outputs all the same. I could feel the pressure traveling through the organization like a vibration in the walls. Richard grew restless. That was obvious even from a distance. He started asking for reassurances he didn't need when things were actually under control. Jonathan, on the other hand, became defensive, over-explaining decisions, insisting on processes, leaning hard on authority instead of understanding. It was the kind of behavior you see when people sense a threat but can't locate it. They knew something was wrong, they just didn't know where to look. I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be in their minds, gone, harmless, a former employee who had moved on. That illusion mattered more than anything else. I took no public credit. I avoided industry events where I knew they would be present. I even declined a speaking invitation that would have put my name back into the same professional circles. Remaining small was part of the strategy. Privately, I watched how revenge was changing me. Not in the way people expect. I wasn't becoming cruel. I wasn't obsessed. I was becoming precise. My thinking sharpened, emotions flattened into something usable. I started to understand why patience feels unnatural to people who rely on power. It requires self-control, and self-control reveals weaknesses. The time pressure arrived quietly. Brightline accelerated their timeline, citing market conditions. An internal audit was scheduled at Hawthorne, framed as routine but timed too perfectly to be coincidence. Deadlines stacked on top of each other, compressing decision-making windows. When organizations feel squeezed, they make mistakes. I didn't need to cause those mistakes. I only needed to allow them. There was a moment, late one night, when I questioned the path I was on, not because I felt sympathy, but because I felt distance from the person I used to be. The Michael who believed recognition was earned through endurance would not have recognized this version of himself. That realization didn't stop me. It clarified something else. Identity isn't fixed, it's responsive. I noticed paranoia setting in. Richard began looping senior leadership into conversations that didn't require them, hoping proximity would substitute for certainty. Jonathan asked for redundancies that created contradictions. The more they tried to protect themselves, the more exposed the gaps became. And still, they didn't look in the one direction that mattered. What they couldn't see was that my access hadn't ended when my employment did. The systems I designed weren't just operational, they were archival. Decision trees, version histories, logic trails, all created to ensure accountability, originally intended to protect the firm. I had built them to be transparent. What transparency really does, though, is remember. Brightline reached out again, this time with concern. I responded slower than before. Timing matters. I let the silence stretch just enough to raise stakes, then provided a narrow answer that confirmed their suspicions without offering resolution. I wasn't misleading them. I was letting the truth surface at its own pace. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? That question stayed with me as the audit date approached. I knew that if I acted too soon, they would close ranks. Too late, and the damage would dilute. Precision mattered.
I reviewed documents I hadn't opened in months, memos, logs, early drafts with timestamps that told a story no one else had bothered to read. The fear finally became visible when Richard tried to contact me directly, not officially, not through legal channels, a casual message, friendly tone, a question about availability. I didn't respond. Silence forces people to confront their own thoughts, and his were already working against him. Jonathan wasn't as subtle. He attempted to rewrite history in real time, issuing internal clarifications that contradicted archived records. Every correction created another discrepancy. Every attempt to regain control left fingerprints. By then, the pressure had narrowed their options to reaction, and reaction is never strategic. I wasn't enjoying this. That surprised me. What I felt instead was inevitability, like watching a structure collapse exactly the way you calculated it would. The satisfaction came not from their discomfort, but from the confirmation that truth, when given time, becomes unavoidable. They still believed I had walked away with nothing but resentment. What they didn't know, what no one at Hawthorne realized yet, was that I still had access to something they couldn't afford to have exposed, something embedded so deeply into the foundation of their success that removing it would unravel more than a single project. And when the time came, I wouldn't even need to touch it at all.
The first visible crack appeared in a place no one expected: public confidence. Not panic, not scandal, just hesitation. Brightline postponed a press-facing update without explanation. Industry chatter softened. Analysts stopped repeating Hawthorne's talking points verbatim and began adding qualifiers. Words like review and reassessment slipped into conversations where certainty used to live. From the outside, it looked like caution. From the inside, it felt like erosion. I stayed calm. That was the most unsettling part for them. While calendars filled with emergency meetings and inboxes pulsed with requests marked urgent, my days remained quiet. I worked, I exercised, I answered emails when it suited the timing. Chaos spread without needing my presence. That was proof the plan was already in motion. Richard tried to regain control by increasing visibility. He spoke more, presented more, flooded rooms with confidence he didn't feel. It backfired. The louder he became, the clearer it was that he was compensating for something missing. People sense that, especially when the numbers stop agreeing with the narrative. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Not dramatic, not hostile. A request for coffee framed as reconciliation. We met in a neutral place. He smiled too quickly, asked how I was doing, complimented my next chapter. Then came the pivot, an offer to consult, short-term, informal, framed as collaboration. He never apologized. He never acknowledged what had been taken. He spoke as if the past could be folded neatly into the present and forgotten. I declined politely, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because accepting would have disrupted the sequence. He left unsettled, unsure why the conversation hadn't gone the way he rehearsed it. That uncertainty followed him back to the office like a shadow. Jonathan took a different approach. He attempted intimidation disguised as professionalism, legal language, vague reminders about confidentiality, an implication that my silence was expected. I listened. I said very little. The truth didn't need defense. It had documentation. What neither of them knew, what made their efforts irrelevant, was that the plan didn't begin after I resigned. It began months earlier, the moment I noticed my name disappearing from drafts. I had started keeping records then, not out of spite, out of instinct. Version history saved automatically, design rationales logged carefully, decision matrices preserved exactly as they were approved. I didn't alter anything. I didn't need to. I just made sure it couldn't be erased. Public consequences accelerated. The audit expanded. What was meant to be procedural became investigative. Questions shifted from how to who. Responsibility matters when outcomes wobble. And when responsibility is unclear, organizations search for paper trails. Mine were immaculate.
I remained outwardly composed as the net tightened. I attended meetings unrelated to Hawthorne. I spoke about strategy to people who valued attribution. Every interaction reminded me how small the old room had been. That perspective steadied me when the pressure peaked. Richard called again. This time his tone was strained. He asked for clarity, for guidance, for help. I told him the truth gently. I no longer had authority there. That answer frightened him more than any accusation could have. Authority is comforting when it's shared, terrifying when it's gone. Jonathan's attempts to control the narrative collapsed under their own weight. Each revision contradicted a prior statement. Each clarification invited scrutiny. The archive did the rest. Transparency doesn't accuse, it reveals. By the time leadership acknowledged a misalignment in project ownership, the damage was already moving faster than they could contain. Clients notice hesitation. Markets notice silence. Trust, once cracked, doesn't wait for permission to break. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Watching inevitability unfold isn't joy, it's gravity. You don't cheer when something falls. You step back and let it land. The moment that mattered most came quietly. An internal memo circulated with corrected attributions. My name appeared where it always should have been. Too late. Recognition after erasure doesn't restore what was taken. It confirms it. They were still trying to stop what had already happened, still negotiating outcomes that were no longer negotiable, still searching for leverage where none remained. By the time they understood the scope of what had been set in motion, the consequences were no longer approaching. They had already arrived.
By the time the pressure reached its peak, it wasn't coming from them anymore. It was coming from everywhere else. Clients wanted answers. Compliance wanted timelines. Leadership wanted assurances no one could honestly give. Hawthorne had become a place where every decision carried the weight of potential exposure, and that kind of environment doesn't just strain systems, it fractures people. I felt it, even from a distance, like standing near a fault line and sensing the ground adjust beneath your feet. This was the phase I hadn't anticipated fully, the internal cost. Not to them, but to me. Precision requires isolation. I had cut myself off from emotions that once defined how I worked, pride, ambition, even resentment, because they interfered with clarity. What replaced them was focus, but focus has a price. There were nights I stared at my screen and wondered when calculation had become more familiar than instinct, whether finishing this would cost me something I wouldn't know how to name. For a moment, I almost walked away. The audit was deep enough now that truth would surface with or without my involvement. The plan could succeed on inertia alone. I imagined choosing distance instead, letting time handle the rest, reclaiming my life fully. That temptation was real, not because I was afraid, but because I was tired. Revenge, even the quiet kind, asks for patience longer than anger can sustain. The reversal came unexpectedly. Brightline informed Hawthorne they were pausing all expansion talks pending final attribution review. That single sentence shifted everything. Expansion was Jonathan's leverage. Without it, his influence weakened overnight. Internal alliances realigned. People who had been silent began protecting themselves instead. Momentum doesn't need encouragement once it turns. Emotion caught up with me then, suddenly and without warning. Not triumph, grief. Grief for the version of myself that had believed endurance was the same as dignity. Grief for the years I had given without understanding the exchange rate. It almost broke my composure, almost made me intervene emotionally instead of strategically. That was the danger point, the place where most plans fail, not because of opposition, but because the architect loses patience with inevitability. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? I asked myself that question repeatedly in the quiet hours. The answer didn't arrive as confidence, it arrived as acceptance. I didn't need to like who this process had made me. I only needed to be honest about why I was continuing. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about closing a loop that had been left open too long. The final miscalculation came from Richard. He assumed desperation would make me reachable.
He sent a message acknowledging mistakes without naming them, offering public credit in exchange for cooperation. It was the first time he admitted anything had been wrong. It was also too late. Repair offered under pressure isn't accountability, it's negotiation. I declined again, briefly, professionally. That refusal traveled faster than I expected. People talk when outcomes are uncertain, and in that movement of information, something shifted. Patterns became visible, names connected to decisions, timelines aligned. That was when they finally understood they weren't facing a crisis. They were facing a person. Jonathan realized it first. You could see it in how he stopped issuing statements and started asking questions. Richard followed slower, clinging to the hope that this was still procedural, still fixable. But by then, the narrative had moved beyond them. Control had changed hands without a meeting, without a vote. I felt the weight of it then, the emotional cost, the knowledge that whatever came next would be final, that there was no version of this where we all walked away unchanged. And in that stillness, as the last pieces locked into place, the truth became unavoidable to everyone involved. They finally knew who had been dismantling them, and there was nothing left they could do to stop it.
The collapse didn't arrive with noise. There were no emergency announcements, no dramatic resignations broadcast to the public. It came the way structural failures always do, quietly, then all at once. Brightline formally terminated the long-term contract, citing material misrepresentation of authorship and operational ownership. Those words mattered. They weren't emotional, they weren't accusatory, they were precise. And precision is what makes damage permanent. Jonathan stepped down first. Officially, it was framed as a strategic transition. Unofficially, everyone knew why. Influence evaporates when credibility does, and his had been built on borrowed architecture. Without expansion leverage, without client trust, he became a liability the firm could no longer justify carrying. Richard followed weeks later, not fired, reassigned, a polite exile into irrelevance. That was the cruelest outcome for someone who had lived on visibility. I watched all of it without comment. No interviews, no posts, no victory laps. The silence unsettled people more than any statement could have. Colleagues reached out quietly, asking if I was satisfied. I didn't answer that question directly because satisfaction wasn't the point. Resolution was. The firm issued internal corrections, attribution records updated, processes revised, training modules rewritten to emphasize ethical ownership. All necessary, all too late. Institutions can correct records, but they can't undo erasure. The years I lost waiting to be seen didn't return because my name appeared on a document. What I had lost was never just a job, it was momentum, identity, the future version of myself I had been moving toward without realizing how fragile it was. That version disappeared the day I understood that loyalty without leverage is invisible. That loss stays with you. You don't recover it. You replace it with something else. What I reclaimed wasn't power, it was control. Control over my work, my time, my silence. I chose where my expertise went and where it didn't. I chose environments where clarity mattered more than hierarchy and results mattered more than performance. The revenge wasn't destroying them, it was no longer needing them. People assume revenge must be loud to be effective. They imagine confrontation, exposure, humiliation. What they miss is how fragile systems become when truth is allowed to surface on its own schedule. I didn't accuse, I documented. I didn't threaten, I waited. Patience did what anger never could. In the end, no one thanked me, and that was exactly right. Gratitude would have misunderstood what happened. This wasn't about recognition anymore, it was about correction. Richard sent one final message months later, short, neutral, acknowledging that he should have handled things differently. I didn't reply. Closure doesn't require participation from both sides. Sometimes it only needs acceptance from one.
I think about the younger version of myself occasionally, the one who believed staying quiet was professionalism, that being indispensable was protection. I don't judge him. He didn't know what he was being trained for. Silence can be submission, or it can be strategy. The difference is intention. The firm survived, technically. Companies usually do. But something essential was gone. Trust takes longer to rebuild than revenue. And for the people who watched how easily credit had been reassigned, how quietly truth had been corrected, nothing felt solid anymore. That kind of doubt doesn't fade. It settles. As for me, I didn't emerge victorious in the way stories usually end. I emerged intact, and that mattered more. I learned that revenge doesn't always restore what was taken, but it can prevent it from being taken again. The most devastating part wasn't what happened to them. It was how little I needed to say to make it happen. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.